The dust devil danced across the parched earth, a swirling column of red against the bleached sky. Caleb squinted, his hand shading his eyes. Had been tracking a stray calf for the better part of the morning, and the heat shimmered off the plains like a tangible thing. It was the glint of metal that caught his attention first, reflecting the sun's brutal glare. Then he saw her. A girl, no older than 7, perched on a rocky outcrop. Too small to be out here alone. As he drew closer, the details sharpened. Her clothes, once bright, were now faded and torn. Her face was gaunt, streaked with dirt and tears. In her lap, she clutched a rusty tin can. He reined in his horse, a slow, deliberate action. Didn't want to spook her. "Howdy," he said, his voice raspy from the dust. She didn't answer, just stared at him with wide, wary eyes. He dismounted, letting the reins drop to the ground. The horse, a seasoned cow pony named Maggie, stood patiently. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The glint of metal head seen earlier came into focus. It was a shovel, leaning against a mound of freshly turned earth. A grave. He stopped a few feet away. "You all right, little one?" She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. She pointed a trembling finger at the mound. He understood. Without a word, he knelt down, his calloused hand reaching out, hesitating, then gently touching her arm. Her skin was hot and dry. "She's gone," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mascon." Caleb remained silent, offering her a moment to gather herself. Had seen death on the plains before. Too much of it. He knew better than to offer empty platitudes. "Comanche got our wagon," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength. "Took Pa. Ma got sick." He didn't press her for details. He knew enough. The Comanche raids had been getting worse, pushing further east in search of supplies. And sickness was a constant companion on the frontier. He looked at the grave, at the tin can she clutched so tightly. Probably all the water she had left. The sun beat down mercilessly. She wouldn't last long out here alone. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Nothing but endless plains, shimmering under the relentless sun. He looked back at the girl, at the tiny figure guarding her mother's grave. "My name's Caleb," he said, his voice low and steady. "What's yours?" "Lily," she mumbled, her eyes still fixed on the small mound of dirt. "My name's Lily." Caleb nodded once, acknowledging her. He didn't press her for more. Names mattered out here. They were a piece of yourself you offered, a fragile connection in a harsh land. He turned back to Maggie, untying his bedroll and a small canvas bag from behind the saddle. He walked a short distance away, enough to give her space, but close enough to keep her in sight. He found a small patch of relatively clear ground and began to unpack. He didn't speak, didn't offer false assurances. He simply went about the business of making camp. He gathered some dried brush and built a small fire, shielding it from the wind with a few carefully placed rocks. The smoke rose in a thin, gray plume, a lonely signal in the vast emptiness. Lily watched him, her eyes tracking his every movement. He could feel her gaze, a weight on his back. He knew she was scared, alone, and grieving. He knew, too, that words wouldn't help right now. Actions would. He brewed some coffee in a dented tin pot, the aroma a familiar comfort in the desolate landscape. He opened the canvas bag, pulling out a strip of dried beef and a handful of hardtack. He walked over to Lily, kneeling down beside her. He offered her the food. She hesitated, her eyes darting from the food to his face. He simply held it out, his expression unreadable. Finally, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his calloused hand. She took the beef and hardtack, clutching them tightly. She ate slowly, methodically, her gaze still fixed on the grave. Caleb watched her, his own hunger forgotten. He knew what it was like to lose everything. The emptiness, the gnawing ache that never truly went away. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Caleb spread out his bedroll a few yards from Lily. He didn't offer her a place beside him. He knew she needed to be near her mother. He sat by the fire, sipping his coffee, the silence broken only by the crackling flames and the distant howl of a coyote. He closed his eyes, and the ghosts came. His wife, Sarah, her laughter echoing in the wind. His son, Thomas, his small hand reaching for Caleb's. Gone. All gone, taken by the fever that swept through the valley like a wildfire. He opened his eyes, the memories sharp and painful. Had been powerless then, unable to save them. He wouldn't be powerless now. He looked over at Lily, a small dark silhouette against the fading light. He couldn't bring back her mother, couldn't erase her pain. But he could offer her shelter, food, and a silent promise that she wasn't alone. Not anymore. He leaned back against his saddle, the cold earth seeping into his bones. He stared up at the stars, a million pinpricks of light in the vast, indifferent sky. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he couldn't leave her out here. Not alone. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the darkening sky. Caleb watched Lily, a small, huddled shape near the grave. She hadn't moved since taking the food, her gaze fixed on the mound of earth as if willing her mother to rise again. He knew that look. Had seen it in the mirror for months after Sarah and Thomas were gone. The hollowed-out stare of someone who'd lost everything, clinging to the last vestige of hope, even when hope was a fool's errand. He poured himself another cup of coffee, the bitter liquid a familiar comfort. He thought about the ranch, miles to the south. His place. Empty, save for Maggie and the few head of cattle he still ran. He hadn't been back in weeks, driven by a restless need to wander, to escape the ghosts that haunted every corner of the house. Now, those ghosts had company. He finished his coffee, tossing the dregs into the fire. He stood up, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. The night air was cold, carrying the scent of sage and dust. He walked over to Maggie, retrieving a worn blanket from behind the saddle. He approached Lily slowly, careful not to startle her. He knelt down a few feet away, holding out the blanket. "Here," he said, his voice gruff. "You'll be cold." She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge him. Her eyes remained fixed on the grave, unblinking. He hesitated, then gently laid the blanket on the ground beside her. He didn't try to cover her, didn't force the gesture. He simply left it there, a silent offering. He returned to the fire, adding more brush to the flames. The light flickered, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding plains. He sat down, his back against his saddle, and watched her. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher in the sky, bathing the landscape in a pale, ethereal glow. The coyotes howled in the distance, their mournful cries echoing across the emptiness. Lily remained motionless, a small dark silhouette against the moonlit earth. He knew she wasn't sleeping. He could feel her pain, a palpable thing in the still night air. He knew she was replaying the events of the past few days, reliving the terror of the Comanche raid, the slow, agonizing decline of her mother. He knew she was alone with her grief, trapped in a silent world of loss and fear. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him. A stranger, a threat, or perhaps, a glimmer of hope in the vast darkness. He didn't know. He only knew he couldn't leave her out here. Not alone. He closed his eyes, listening to the crackling fire and the mournful howls of the coyotes. He drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by the ghosts of his past and the silent sorrow of the girl beside the grave. The first streaks of dawn painted the eastern sky a pale rose, chasing away the darkness and silencing the coyotes. Caleb woke stiff and cold, the embers of the fire barely glowing. He glanced over at Lily. She hadn't moved, still huddled near the grave, the blanket untouched beside her. He rose slowly, his joints protesting, with a chorus of pops and creaks. He walked over to the fire, adding more brush to coax the flames back to life. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the rich aroma cutting through the chill morning air. He knew she hadn't slept. He could see it in the slump of her shoulders, the way her head was bowed, the utter stillness of her small body. He knew, too, that forcing her to eat or talk would do no good. Grief was a private thing, a wound that needed to be tended with patience and respect. He poured himself a cup of coffee, then grabbed his canteen and his shovel. He walked over to Maggie, stroking her muzzle before untying a coil of rope from the saddle. He walked towards the small creek bed, heads spotted the evening before, a narrow ribbon of water snaking through the parched landscape. He returned a while later, the canteen full and the rope looped around a large flat stone head found near the creek. He walked towards the grave, ignoring Lily's presence as if she were a part of the landscape itself. He set the canteen down beside the mound of earth. Then, using the rope and the flat stone as a makeshift drag, he began to smooth out the rough surface of the grave. He worked slowly, deliberately, his movements economical and precise. He pulled weeds, carefully plucking them from the dry earth and tossing them aside. He rearranged the loose stones that marked the edges of the grave, creating a more defined boundary. He didn't speak, didn't offer any words of comfort or explanation. He simply worked, his actions a silent testament to the respect he felt for the woman buried beneath the ground. Lily watched him, her eyes following his every move. He could feel her gaze, a silent question hanging in the air. He didn't acknowledge her, didn't break the rhythm of his work. When he was finished, the grave looked neater, more cared for. It was a small thing, a simple gesture, but it was all he could offer. He poured some water from the canteen onto the grave, dampening the dry earth. He stepped back, surveying his work. He knew it wasn't much, but it was a start. A way of saying, "We remember you. You are not forgotten." He turned to leave, then paused. He walked back to the grave and placed a tin can Lily had been clutching on top of the mound. He filled it with water from the canteen, creating a small, makeshift vase. He walked back to the fire, leaving Lily alone with her grief and the newly tended grave. He knew he couldn't take away her pain, but perhaps, just perhaps, he had offered her a small measure of solace, a silent promise that she wasn't entirely alone in her mourning. The simple act of tending to the grave, a shared ritual in a harsh land, was all he had to offer for now. He sat by the fire, the coffee doing little to thaw the chill in his bones. He watched Lily, still a statue, beside the grave. smoothing the earth, placing the water. It was a ritual he knew well. Too well. It brought back another grave, another broken promise. He saw Sarah's face then, clear as day. Had sworn to protect her, to build a life for them, a safe haven in this unforgiving land. Had brought her to that valley, lured by the promise of fertile soil and plentiful game. Had built a cabin with his own 2 hands, a sturdy little place meant to withstand the harsh winters and the roaming predators. Had believed he could keep them safe. Then the Skinners came. He clenched his jaw, the memory a raw wound that refused to heal. They were a pack of wolves in human skin, led by a man with eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. They'd swept through the valley like a plague, leaving a trail of destruction and despair in their wake. Had been away, hunting, when they attacked. Had returned to find the cabin burned to the ground, Sarah gone. Thomas too. Had found their bodies, desecrated, left as a warning. A warning Had carried with him ever since. Had tried to track them, the Skinners. Had followed their trail for weeks, fueled by rage and a burning desire for vengeance. But they were ghosts, moving across the land with the cunning born of desperation and cruelty. He lost their trail in the canyons of the Painted Desert, swallowed by the vastness of the West. Had made a promise to Sarah, a vow whispered in the quiet intimacy of their cabin, to protect her and Thomas, to keep them safe from harm. Had failed, utterly and completely. He looked at Lily again, her small form silhouetted against the brightening sky. He saw Sarah in her then, a flicker of that same vulnerability, that same innocent trust. He couldn't fail again. He wouldn't. This time he'd keep his promise, even if it meant facing the devils of his past. The Skinners might be long gone, but the darkness they left behind still lingered. And he wouldn't let that darkness claim another innocent soul. He took a deep breath, the air sharp and cold in his lungs. He had a debt to repay, not just to Lily, but to Sarah, to Thomas, to himself. He would keep this girl safe. He would. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth and turning the air shimmering hot. Caleb nursed his coffee, the silence stretching, thick and heavy. Lily hadn't moved. He knew she was listening, though, even if she didn't show it. A rider appeared on the horizon, a lone figure against the vast canvas of the plains. Caleb watched him approach, his hand instinctively drifting towards the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. The man was dressed in the rough-spun clothes of a trader, his horse weary and travel-stained. The trader reined in his horse near the fire, his eyes scanning the scene. Caleb, Lily by the grave, Maggie grazing peacefully nearby. He touched the brim of his dusty hat. "Morning," he said, his voice raspy. "Name's Jedediah. Thought. Figured I'd stop for some water, if you don't mind." "Help yourself," Caleb replied, his voice low. He watched Jedediah dismount and led his horse towards the creek. The trader was wiry, with a weathered face and eyes that darted nervously. Caleb didn't trust him. Not yet. Jedediah watered his horse, then filled his canteen. As he straightened up, he cleared his throat. "Heard some talk down in Redemption," he said, his voice hesitant. "Folks are saying the Skinners are back." Caleb froze, his hand tightening on his coffee cup. The Skinners. The name was a brand on his soul. He forced himself to remain calm, his expression unreadable. "Skinners?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Thought they were long gone?" Jedediah shifted uncomfortably. That's what most folks thought. But there's been sightings. Raids, got you more. Same brutal style. They say they're headed north, towards the Broken Tooth Range. He glanced at Lily, then back at Caleb, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. Just thought you ought to know. The Broken Tooth Range. That was too close. Too damn close. Caleb felt a cold dread grip his heart. They were coming. He knew it. He could feel it in the air. A malevolent presence drawing nearer. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the trader. Thanks for the warning, he said. Appreciate it. Jedediah hesitated, then remounted his horse. You be careful out here, he said, his voice low. The West ain't a place for the faint of heart. He spurred his horse and rode off, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts. And his fear. He looked at Lily, still by the grave. He had to protect her. He had to. The Skinners were a storm on the horizon, and he was the only thing standing between her and the fury of their wrath. He would not fail again. The trader's words hung in the air, a poisoned arrow finding its mark. The Skinners. Back. That all. Ed hoped, prayed. They were nothing more than a nightmare fading into the past. Jedediah's warning slammed the door shut on that hope. Caleb swirled the remaining coffee in his cup, the ground settling into a dark, muddy swirl, mirroring the turmoil in his gut. He glanced at Lily. She hadn't reacted to the trader's words, seemingly lost in her grief-stricken world. Perhaps she hadn't even heard. Or perhaps, hardened by loss, she understood the brutal realities of this land better than most. He knew what he should do. He should pack up Saddle Maggie and ride south, away from the Broken Tooth Range, away from the Skinners. He should find a town, any town, where Lily could find some semblance of safety, some chance at a normal life. He could leave her there, perhaps with the family, and then he could hunt the Skinners, track them down and send them back to hell where they belonged. That was the logical choice, the responsible choice, the safe choice. But as he looked at Lily, huddled near that freshly turned grave, he knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't abandon her. Not again. He couldn't condemn her to a life of uncertainty, of relying on the kindness of strangers. Had made a promise, a silent vow, etched in the dust and grief of this forsaken place. He would protect her, and running away wasn't protection. It was cowardice. He could see Sarah's face again, her eyes filled with trust. Had run then, in a way. Had left her alone when he went hunting, believing he was providing for their future. Had been wrong. Terribly, fatally wrong. He wouldn't make that mistake again. But staying meant risking everything, exposing Lily to the very violence he was trying to shield her from. The Skinners weren't just raiders, they were butchers, leaving a trail of broken lives and shattered dreams in their wake. He knew their methods, their cruelty, had seen it firsthand. He stood up, the decision made. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. He would face the darkness head-on, and he would protect Lily, even if it meant sacrificing himself in the process. He owed her that much. He owed Sarah that much. He walked towards Maggie, his hand resting on the worn leather of his saddle. He had preparations to make, defenses to build, a promise to keep. The West was coming for them, and he would be ready. He tightened the cinch on Maggie's saddle, the leather creaking softly in the growing heat. Had spent the morning reinforcing the cabin, boarding up the windows, securing the door. A flimsy defense, perhaps, against men like the Skinners. But it was all he had. Had also set snares in the surrounding woods, simple traps designed to slow them down, give him a warning. He wasn't fooling himself. It wouldn't be enough to stop them. But it might buy him time. Time to get Lily to safety. Time to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. Had avoided talking to Lily about the Skinners. He didn't want to frighten her more than she already was. But he knew she wasn't blind. She saw him reinforcing the cabin, setting the snares. She felt the tension in the air, the unspoken fear that hung heavy between them. He finished saddling Maggie and turned to Lily, who was now sitting by the creek, skipping stones across the water. "Lily," he said, his voice gentle, "I need you to listen to me." She looked up, her eyes still clouded with grief, but there was a flicker of understanding in them. "There might be some trouble coming," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Some bad men. I need you to be brave, and I need you to do exactly what I tell you to do." He saw the fear in her eyes then, stark and raw. But he also saw a glimmer of resilience, a stubborn refusal to be broken. She nodded slowly, her lips pressed together. "If you hear any shooting," he continued, "or see anyone you don't recognize, I want you to go to the root cellar. You know where it is?" She nodded again. "Stay there," he said. "Don't come out, no matter what you hear. Understand?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He knelt down beside her and took her hand. Her small fingers were cold and trembling. "I'll protect you, Lily," he said, his voice firm. "I promise." He wanted to believe the words he was saying, but a cold knot of doubt twisted in his gut. Promises were fragile things in this land, easily broken. As dusk settled, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the riders came, not in a thunderous charge, but a slow, deliberate approach, their horses moving with a predatory grace. Caleb watched them from the shadows of the cabin, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. There were 5 of them, their faces grim and weathered, their eyes cold and empty. They were led by a man with a cruel scar that bisected his left cheek, a permanent reminder of some past violence. They reined in their horses a short distance from the cabin, their eyes scanning the scene. The leader dismounted and walked towards the grave, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on the freshly turned soil. Then he spat on the grave and turned to his men. "All right," he said, his voice raspy. "Let's see what treasures this dead man took with him." Caleb felt a surge of rage, a white-hot fury that threatened to consume him. They weren't here for revenge. They weren't here for justice. They were here to desecrate a grave, to rob a dead man. He wouldn't let them. He wouldn't. He stepped out of the shadows, the cold peacemaker appearing in his hand as if by magic. The click of the hammer echoed in the still evening air. "That's far enough," Caleb said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of the mountains. The leader of the Skinners stopped, his scarred face twisting into a sneer. He looked Caleb up and down, assessing the threat. Well, he drawled, his voice thick with menace. "Looks like we got ourselves a guardian angel. You gonna try and stop us, old man?" Caleb didn't reply. He simply raised the Colt, the barrel unwavering, aimed directly at the Skinner's heart. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, but he also knew he had something to fight for, something worth dying for. "This is sacred ground," he said, his voice hardening. "You ain't touching nothing here." The Skinner laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Sacred? This is just dirt, old man. And that's all you'll be soon enough. He gestured to his men, who began to dismount, their own weapons drawn. Kill him, he said, his eyes never leaving Caleb's. And then we'll see what's buried with the stiff. Caleb braced himself. He knew this was it. The moment of truth. He took a deep breath, focusing on the present, pushing aside the fear, the doubt. He thought of Lily, huddled in the root cellar, waiting, trusting him to protect her. He wouldn't fail her. The first Skinner lunged forward, a rusty knife glinting in his hand. Caleb sidestepped the attack, his movements surprisingly quick for a man his age. He brought the Colt down on the Skinner's wrist, the bone snapping with a sickening crack. The Skinner screamed, dropping the knife and clutching his arm. The other Skinners opened fire, the sound of gunfire shattering the evening calm. Bullets whizzed past Caleb, kicking up dust around his feet. He ducked behind the grave, using it as cover, returning fire with deadly accuracy. He knew he couldn't win a straight gunfight. He had to be smart. He had to be ruthless. He saw an opportunity. One of the Skinners was reloading his rifle, his back turned. Caleb aimed carefully and squeezed the trigger. The Skinner grunted and fell to the ground, the rifle clattering beside him. 2 down. 3 to go. He knew he couldn't stay behind the grave forever. It was only a matter of time before they flanked him. He had to move. He had to find a better position. He risked a glance towards the cabin. He could see Lily peering out from behind the boarded-up window, her face pale and terrified. He gave her a small nod, a silent reassurance. He would protect her. He would. He took another deep breath and charged forward, firing as he ran, a whirlwind of fury and desperation. Caleb charged, the Colt bucking in his hand, spitting lead. He saw the surprise on the faces of the remaining Skinners, the momentary hesitation before they returned fire. He used that hesitation, that fraction of a second, to his advantage. He dropped to a knee, using the uneven ground as cover, firing with a practiced rhythm, each shot precise, each bullet finding its mark. Another Skinner went down, clutching his leg, howling in pain. But the other 2 were relentless, firing steadily, forcing Caleb to scramble for cover behind a gnarled oak tree. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the whine of ricocheting bullets a constant threat. He felt a searing pain in his left arm, a bullet tearing through flesh. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, focusing on the fight. He knew he couldn't last much longer. He was outnumbered, wounded, and running out of ammunition. He had to make a stand, had to find a way to even the odds. He risked a glance around the tree, assessing the situation. The Skinner leader, the one with the scar, was circling around, trying to flank him. The other was keeping him pinned down with a steady barrage of fire. Caleb took a deep breath, steeling himself. He had one last chance. He waited for the Skinner leader to get closer, waited until he was just within range. Then he exploded from behind the tree, firing the Colt point-blank. The Skinner leader staggered back, a look of disbelief on his face. The bullet had hit him square in the chest. He clutched at the wound, his eyes wide with shock. But he didn't fall. He raised his own pistol, his hand shaking, and fired. Caleb felt a jolt of pain in his side, a searing, burning sensation. He stumbled, his vision blurring. He knew he'd been hit, but he couldn't afford to stop. He had to finish this. He raised the Colt again, his arm trembling, and fired one last shot. The Skinner leader finally collapsed, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged breathing of the wounded Skinner and the distant chirping of crickets. Caleb leaned against the tree, his body trembling, his vision fading. He was bleeding badly, his side a crimson mess. He knew he was in trouble. The wounded Skinner, seeing his leader fall, let out a strangled cry of rage and limped towards Caleb, his pistol raised. Caleb tried to raise the Colt, but his arm was too weak. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the final shot. But the shot never came. Instead, a high-pitched scream pierced the night. "Leave him alone." Caleb's eyes snapped open. He saw Lily, a tiny figure emerging from the cabin, a stone clutched in her small hand. She hurled the stone with all her might, striking the wounded Skinner square in the back of the head. He stumbled, momentarily losing his balance, his shot going wild. It wasn't much, a child's throw against a grown man's rage. But it was enough. It broke the man's concentration, diverted his fury for a crucial heartbeat. Caleb, fueled by a surge of adrenaline, seized the opportunity. He might be bleeding, his vision blurring, but his reflexes were still sharp. With a grunt, he forced himself upright, ignoring the searing pain in his side. He aimed the Colt, his hand shaking violently, and squeezed the trigger one last time. The bullet found its mark. The wounded Skinner crumpled to the ground, his pistol clattering uselessly beside him. Silence fell again, heavier this time, punctuated only by Lily's ragged sobs. Caleb slowly lowered the Colt, the weight of it feeling immense in his weakened hand. He looked at Lily, standing frozen in the doorway of the cabin, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "Lily?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. "Get back inside." She didn't move, her eyes wide with terror and something else, defiance. He saw a flicker of the same stubborn resilience had seen earlier, a refusal to be cowed by the violence she had witnessed. He took a step towards her, then another, his legs unsteady. The world swam before his eyes. He had to get her back inside. He had to protect her. "It's over," he said, his voice stronger this time. "It's safe now. Come on, Lily." She hesitated for a moment longer. Then slowly, cautiously, she began to walk towards him. As she drew closer, he saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, gratitude, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of hope. He reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly firm despite his injuries. Her small fingers tightened around his, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them in this crucible of violence. Together, they walked back to the cabin, leaving the dead men and the acrid smell of gunpowder behind them. The West was still a wild and unforgiving place, but tonight at least, a small act of courage had tilted the scales, offering a fragile hope for a future free from fear. Inside the dim cabin, Caleb gently guided Lily to a rickety chair. The single flickering candle cast long dancing shadows on the walls, exaggerating the smallness of the space and the starkness of their situation. He leaned against the doorframe, his strength failing, the crimson stains spreading across his side. He knew he needed to tend to his wounds, but Lily came first. Her wide, frightened eyes were fixed on him, reflecting the candlelight like tiny pools of liquid fear. "You were brave, Lily," he managed to say, his voice raspy. "Real brave." She didn't respond, just continued to stare, her small body trembling. He knew she had seen too much. No child should witness such violence. Had hoped to shield her, to give her a chance at a normal life, but the West had a way of shattering even the best intentions. He pushed himself away from the doorframe, each movement sending a jolt of pain through his body. He had to stay conscious. He had to protect her. "I need to clean this up," he said, gesturing weakly to his side. "Can you fetch me some water and a clean cloth?" She nodded silently and scurried to the wash basin, her movements quick and efficient, born of necessity. He watched her, a wave of tenderness washing over him. She was so young, so vulnerable, yet she possessed a strength he hadn't anticipated. As she brought him the water and cloth, he noticed her gaze drift towards the window, towards the bodies lying still in the moonlight. He knew what she was thinking. What now? What happens next? He took the cloth and began to dab at the wound, the pain intense, almost unbearable. He gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out. He wouldn't let her see him weak. "They won't be back," he said, his voice firm. "They won't bother us again." He knew it was a lie. The West was full of men like those Skinners, men driven by greed and desperation. They would be back, or others like them. He finished cleaning the wound as best he could, then ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt to bind it. It was a crude bandage, but it would have to do. He looked at Lily, her eyes still filled with fear. He knew he couldn't stay here. Not anymore. This place was tainted, haunted by the violence she'd witnessed. He had to get her somewhere safe, somewhere she could start over. But where? He had no family, no friends. He was a drifter, a loner, a man with a past he couldn't escape. He saw the answer in her eyes, a silent plea for protection, for a future he wasn't sure he could provide. But he would try. He would do everything in his power to give her the life she deserved. He stood up, his legs wobbly, his body scream in protest. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm, unwavering. "Come on, Lily," he said. "We're leaving." She looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Leaving? Where are we going?" He didn't know, but he knew they couldn't stay here. "Somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere better." He led her out of the cabin, into the cool night air. The bodies of the dead men lay still in the moonlight, a grim reminder of the violence they had survived. He glanced back at the cabin, at the small boarded-up window where Lily had peered out in terror. It was over. He couldn't protect her here any longer. He turned and faced the vast expanse of the plains, the unknown stretching before them like a canvas waiting to be painted. The first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the eastern sky with hues of pink and orange, a stark contrast to the darkness that clung to the land around the cabin. He knew they couldn't leave the dead unburied. It wasn't right. It was a matter of respect, even for men who had lived without it. And it was a matter of safety. The buzzards would be circling soon, and the stench would draw unwanted attention. "Lily," he said, his voice hoarse, "I need you to stay here. Stay close to the cabin. Can you do that for me?" She nodded, her eyes wide and serious. He knew he could trust her. She had a strength that belied her age. He retrieved a shovel from the shed behind the cabin, the metal cold in his hand. He started with the Skinner leader, the one with the scar. He dug a shallow grave, the earth hard and unforgiving. It was back-breaking work, and his wounded side screamed in protest with every shovelful. But he pushed through the pain, driven by a sense of duty he couldn't explain. He dragged the body to the grave, the weight heavy in his arms. He lowered it into the earth, the silence broken only by the scraping of the shovel and his own ragged breathing. He filled the grave, packing the dirt down tight. He repeated the process for the other two skinners, each burial a grim ritual. He made sure their weapons were buried with them. No sense in leaving temptation for anyone else who might stumble across this desolate place. When he was finished, he stood for a moment, looking at the 3 mounds of earth. He wasn't a religious man, but he felt a need to say something, to acknowledge the lives that had ended here. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. "May you find peace," he said, the words simple and heartfelt. "May you find the peace you never knew in life." He then turned his attention to the grave of Lily's parents. It was overgrown with weeds, the wooden cross weathered and worn. He pulled the weeds, clearing the earth around the grave. He straightened the cross, pushing it firmly into the ground. He stood there for a long moment, his head bowed, remembering the kind faces of the couple who had taken him in, who had offered him a place to belong. He owed them more than he could ever repay. He looked at Lily, who was watching him from the doorway of the cabin. He walked over to her, his steps slow and deliberate. "It's time to go," he said, his voice gentle. He took her hand, and together they walked away from the graves, away from the cabin, away from the violence and the memories. They walked towards the rising sun, towards the unknown, towards a future they could only imagine. As they walked, Caleb paused and looked back. He quietly said, "May God bless them, and may God bless us." They walked for what felt like hours, the rising sun beating down on their backs. Caleb led Lily towards the creek he remembered from scouting the land. He knew they needed water, and soon. The horses would need it too, once had managed to catch and saddle them. Lily's small hand was tight in his, her step surprisingly steady despite the ordeal she had been through. He glanced down at her, her face pale but resolute. She hadn't complained once. "Tired?" he asked, his voice rough. She shook her head, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew she was tired, bone-tired, but she wouldn't admit it. Pride, maybe? Or fear of slowing him down? He stopped at the crest of a small hill, the creek visible in the distance, a ribbon of silver winding through the parched landscape. "Well, rest there," he said, pointing towards the creek. "Get some water. Then we'll figure out what to do next." He kept a sharp lookout as they approached the water, scanning the surrounding hills for any sign of danger. The west was a cruel mistress, and safety was a fleeting illusion. They reached the creek and knelt down, cupping their hands to drink the cool, clear water. It tasted like life itself. Lily drank deeply, her thirst evident. While she drank, Caleb scanned the area. He spotted the horses grazing peacefully in a nearby meadow, oblivious to the violence that had unfolded. He felt a pang of guilt. Had been so focused on Lily's safety, had almost forgotten about the animals. "Stay here," he said to Lily, his voice low. "I'm going to get the horses." He left her by the creek, his coat drawn, his senses on high alert. He approached the horses slowly, speaking to them in a low, soothing voice. They recognized him, their ears twitching, their eyes calm. He caught the mare first, the one Lily had ridden before. She was gentle and reliable. He saddled her quickly, his movements efficient. Then he caught the other horse, a sturdy gelding, and saddled him as well. He led the horses back to the creek, where Lily was waiting patiently. He helped her mount the mare, her small body looking even smaller in the saddle. He mounted the gelding, his wounded side protesting with a sharp stab of pain. He ignored it. He had to be strong for Lily. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice firm. "We're riding out." He turned the horses west, towards the setting sun. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew they had to keep moving. They had to find a place where they could be safe, where Lily could have a chance at a new life. As they rode, the vastness of the landscape enveloped them, the silence broken only by the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves and the whisper of the wind. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the plains. Caleb glanced at Lily, her face silhouetted against the fiery sky. She was looking straight ahead, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. He knew she was scared, but she was also strong, stronger than he could have imagined. He felt a surge of hope, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, they could make it. They could find a place to belong, a place where they could finally be at peace. The journey would be long and hard, he knew, but they would face it together. They would ride towards the setting sun, carrying the weight of loss and the fragile promise of a new beginning. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the endless plains in shades of orange and purple. Caleb squinted, the glare reflecting off the dust that coated everything: their clothes, their skin, even the horses' manes. They rode in silence, a silence that was both companionable and heavy with unspoken grief. He glanced at Lily. She sat ramrod straight, her small hands gripping the reins, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. He wondered what she was thinking, what memories were swirling in her young mind. He knew he couldn't erase the horrors she had witnessed, but he could try to build something new, something solid, to replace the emptiness. The West. It was a hard land, unforgiving. It took and took, demanding everything, and offering little in return. Had seen men broken by it, their dreams crushed beneath the weight of drought, poverty, and violence. Had almost been one of them himself. But even in this harsh land, there were glimmers of something else. Moments of kindness, of unexpected connection. He remembered the time a Comanche woman had shared her water skin with him when he was lost and delirious in the desert. He remembered the old prospector who'd nursed him back to health after he had been caught in a blizzard. He remembered Lily's parents, who had taken him in without question, offering him a home and a purpose. Those moments, those small acts of mercy, were what kept him going. They were the embers that refused to be extinguished, even in the face of the harshest winds. He looked at Lily again, her silhouette framed against the dying light. He knew he had to be that ember for her now. He had to shield her from the darkness and guide her towards the light. He nudged his horse closer to hers, their knees brushing. "Well, find a place, Lily," he said, his voice low and gruff. "A place where we can be safe. A place where you can be a kid again." She didn't respond, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of hope, perhaps. Or maybe just a reflection of the setting sun. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The West wasn't a place for easy living. But he was determined. He would fight for her, protect her, give her the future she deserved. He looked out at the vast expanse of the plains, the darkness slowly creeping in. The West remained, wild and untamed. But within that wildness, within that harshness, there was also a possibility for redemption, for healing, for a new beginning. And he would find it for Lily,